name is Matt DeLockery, and when I was growing up, I missed out on some answers to some serious questions I was having. Join me as I seek answers to those questions. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about the question, did Jesus actually exist? Now, the idea that Jesus never actually existed is something that a lot of people have heard and is something you will come across a fair amount. However, pretty much the only place you will hear anything about it is outside of academia. It's a really popular view on the internet, but there's only a handful of scholars with degrees in relevant fields who actually think it's credible. Let me explain what I mean by that. When I say a handful of scholars, I mean you can literally count them on one hand. And when I say scholars who have degrees in relevant fields, I mean they have PhDs in biblical studies, theology, or classical studies, the study of the Greco-Roman world. Now, the reason that I say that these are the only relevant fields is because they're the only fields in which someone has spent a significant amount of time studying historical material that's relevant to asking the question, did Jesus actually exist? So people with degrees in physics, literature, or psychology, for example, would not count here. They may be very smart, but they wouldn't have any special knowledge about this particular historical question. They might be experts in their fields, but in this one, they're laymen. And so the point is that when you count up the number of scholars living today who have a PhD in something that is relevant to the question, the number is very small. Definitely less than 10. It's probably more like 5 in the world. So almost 100% of scholars with degrees in relevant fields think that Jesus existed. Not 60%, not 80%, or even 95%. We're talking about just shy of 100%. There's only a few individual holdouts. And in case you're unaware, there are lots of scholars who don't believe things like Jesus rose from the dead. You don't have to be a Christian to be a New Testament scholar. It surprised me when I first learned that, but that's true. You don't have to be. Nobody checks you at the door to see if you actually believe that Jesus rose from the dead. Nobody forces you to do those things. A lot of people treat it just like any other historical study. And certainly nobody forces Greco-Roman scholars to believe in Christianity, and most of them still think that Jesus existed. Now, let me be clear about something. Just because almost nobody believes that Jesus never existed doesn't mean that that position is wrong. And it also doesn't mean that you shouldn't listen to those people or engage with them. All I'm saying is that they have a pretty big uphill battle. You should always consider the evidence rather than simply counting up the number of scholars who hold to a particular view to see who's right. My point is that the evidence that Jesus existed is really strong, and the case against it is pretty weak. In other words, there are good reasons to think that that Jesus actually existed, and that's why just about everybody believes that Jesus existed. And in this episode, we're going to look at those reasons. So, let me give you a fair warning. I'm going to get pretty deep into the evidence in this episode, because I know it's an important topic to a lot of people. So, if this topic isn't your thing, don't worry about it. We're going to start talking about Jesus' life in the next episode, and you can just pick up there. Now, I just want to make one final point before we start looking at this evidence. A large part of this evidence that I'm going to be using to say that Jesus actually existed, I'm taking from the book, Did Jesus Exist? By Bart Ehrman. Now, if you know the name Bart Ehrman, you'll immediately grasp the significance of that statement. If you don't, so you know, Bart describes himself as an agnostic with atheist leanings. And if you read some of his books or watch his debates, you'll see that he spends a lot of his time trying to argue against traditional Christianity. You know, Jesus didn't rise from the dead, you can't trust what's in the New Testament, and so on and so forth. And yet, partly because people were using him in support of their view that Jesus did not exist, as well as for some other reasons, he wrote a book to take a look at the evidence. Now, there's a lot of things that Bart and I would disagree about, but the fact that Jesus existed is something we would agree on, just like pretty much every other New Testament scholar alive today. So if you want to take a look at Bart's book, Did Jesus Exist? I'll put a link to it in the description of this episode. Anyway, enough intro. Let's look at the evidence. Did Jesus actually exist, or was he just a myth? Here are 5 basic arguments that people who think that Jesus was a myth use to support their theory. First, those in favor of the myth theory that Jesus never existed, say that there are no reliable references by Greek or Roman authors to Jesus outside the New Testament in the first century. They say that the first reference would be Pliny the Younger in 112 AD, but if Jesus was so important, then why weren't people talking about him? Second, they say that the only author outside the New Testament who does mention Jesus is the Jewish historian Josephus. However, they claim that the two references to Jesus in his writings were added in by Christian scribes later on. Third, they also claim that there are very few references to the historical Jesus in the New Testament outside the Gospels. And by that, they mean that people like Paul don't talk about the historical Jesus much in their letters. Let me take a minute to clarify their position. If you've read Paul's letters, you know that Paul talks about Jesus dying and rising from the dead and the effects that has on Christianity and Christians and so forth quite a lot. However, the people who hold to the myth theory point out that Paul doesn't talk about Jesus' life a lot, and that's really their point. They would say that Paul and others are basically thinking of Jesus as a myth that they're building Christianity around, but that this Jesus figure never actually existed. That's why you don't see anything in Paul's letters about the Sermon on the Mount, the parables, his trial, etc. Fourth, the people who think that Jesus was a myth say that the Gospels, then, are the only real sources of information about Jesus. However, they were written decades after his death and are highly problematic as historical documents. They contain loads of contradictions, they're obviously biased, and they have obvious legendary development, and so on and so forth. Furthermore, many of them will say that all of the Gospels go back to just one source, Mark. And so if we only have one source of someone saying that someone existed, how sure can we be of this really? Fifth, and finally, those in favor of the myth theory will say that many of the major stories about Jesus have parallels in pagan religion, such as dying and rising gods. So when you put all of these 5 things together, what you get is a Jesus that was created by the early church to found a religion. However, he was not a real person. He was made up in order to have something to center this new religion on. Now, that's not all of their arguments, but those are some of the main ones. What we're going to do is we're going to take a look at each of these claims one by one. Then we're going to look at 2 reasons to think that Jesus really did exist. And then finally, I'm going to ask one more question, and then we'll finish up. Now, there's a lot of things to cover, and it's going to end up just being this really long list of facts, and it can be a little hard to keep track of. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to divide this episode up into 2 parts, A and B. The objections to Jesus' existence will be part A, and the evidence in favor of Jesus' existence will be part B. And hopefully that'll make things a little more clear and keep you from getting lost in the weeds. All right, so everybody clear on those? Those are the 5 objections, and this is how we're going to go, approach this question of did Jesus exist? Okay, let's take a look at those objections. We're going to go through these one by one, and it's going to take a little while to go through the first 2. There's going to be quite a lot of stuff that we're going to cover. So, number 1, people who believe Jesus never existed say that there were no reliable references by Greek or Roman authors to Jesus outside the New Testament in the first century. Okay, so were there? What do we actually have on record? Well, first of all, that statement is true, that there are no references to Jesus by Greek or Roman authors outside the New Testament in the first century. However, there are 3 that occur shortly after the end of the first century. So the myth people are drawing an artificial line at a convenient point for them, but it cuts out some data that's just on the other side of that line. So while this statement is technically true and it sounds good, we could also say that there are 3 references to Jesus within 100 years of his death. And while both statements are true, they sound a little bit different, don't they? Now, let's get past the quibbling on where we draw the line and look at the data. So, first up, we have Pliny the Younger. He wrote a series of letters to the Emperor Trajan. In letter 10, which was written around 112 AD, about 80 years after the death of Jesus, Pliny the Younger discusses Christians. Basically, he had made an edict saying that no groups were to continue meeting together, but the Christians kept meeting anyway. So Pliny started a search for Christians. Those who were caught and continued to confess Christ were punished. Those who would recant, curse the name of Christ, and offer incense or wine before images of the Emperor Trajan and the gods were let go. Some of the people who were let go said their guilt only amounted to this, and this is Pliny's information on what Christianity was in 112 AD. Quote, "On a stated day, they had been accustomed to meet before daybreak and to recite a hymn among themselves to Christ, as though he were a god, and that so far from binding themselves by oath to commit any crime, their oath was to abstain from theft, robbery, adultery, and from breach of faith, and not to deny trust money placed in their keeping when called upon to deliver it. When the ceremony had concluded, it had been their custom to depart and meet again to take food, but it was of no special character and was quite harmless." End quote. Incidentally, that last bit about the food being harmless was because there was a rumor going around that Christians were cannibals. Remember in the Lord's Supper, Christ talking about eating his body and drinking his blood? If not, don't worry, we'll get to that in a later episode and we'll talk about it then. But if you knew nothing about Christianity, just heard rumors of a strange group with secret rituals, it's not hard to see how someone could think that these things might refer to cannibalism. Anyway, in order to confirm this, Pliny had 2 Christian women, deaconesses, tortured. Standard way of, interrogating someone to make sure that they're really telling you the truth. At least it was back then. Now, Pliny was asking Trajan's opinion about what to do about this group because, as he goes on to say, quote, "This superstition has spread not only through the free cities, but into the villages and the rural districts, and yet it seems to me that it can be checked and set right." End quote. Now, this really doesn't say much about Christ. It says that Christians believed that Christ was a god and that they bound themselves to him by an oath. It also makes reference to the Lord's Supper and some of the contents of Christianity. However, we can't learn actually that much about Christ from this statement, but it does talk about him. So that's Pliny the Younger. Next up, we have Suetonius. Suetonius was a Roman historian who mentions Christ or Christians in his work, Lives of the 12 Caesars. This work was written in 121 AD, around 90 years after the death of Jesus. The first reference occurs in his life or biography of Claudius. Suetonius says, quote, "Since the Jews constantly made disturbances at the instigation of Chrestus, he expelled them from Rome." End quote. Suetonius shows a couple of misunderstandings here. First, he mistakes the name Chrestus for the name Christ, Christus in Latin. In all likelihood, he probably just misheard the name. And given the small number of references to Christ or Christians in his work, a mistake would have been easy because Christians probably just weren't that important to him. And second, Suetonius seems to think that Chrestus is a Jewish leader of some sort who is causing people to revolt. Now, most scholars think that Jesus is meant here, and by that point in time, the point in time when Suetonius was writing, Jesus was already dead. The reign of Claudius was in 41 to 54, so when Suetonius is talking about the expelling of Jews from Rome, he's looking at the fourth 41 to 54, and so Jesus was already dead. So probably what was going on is that the disturbances here were related to the Christian expansion in Rome and the Jewish objections to that expansion. So at the instigation of Chrestus probably means because the controversy surrounding Chrestus, rather than because of a man named Chrestus, was stirring up trouble. So it just means that there was an argument about whoever this Christ figure was. Now, the expulsion from Rome refers to the Edict of Claudius, in which he expelled all Jews from Rome. This expulsion occurred around 49 to 50 AD, but it could have been within a few years of that range. There's a brief mention of this in Acts 18, 1-2, which says, quote, "After this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth, and he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome. End quote. So in his first reference to Christians, Suetonius basically just said that Jews got kicked out of Rome because there was some sort of disturbance over this Jesus or Christ figure. And that's all we know. Now, in Suetonius' second reference, we get a very brief reference to the Christians' persecution under Nero. He says, quote, "Punishment was inflicted on the Christians, a class of men given to a new and mischievous superstition." End quote. Superstition, in Roman terms, basically meant excessive religious devotion. In other words, Christians were going above and beyond what was considered normal in their observance of this new religion. So really all we can get from this is that Christians were really devout. However, our last Greco-Roman source talks more about the persecution under Nero. So our last source is the Roman historian Tacitus. So let me give you the background on what was going on before we get to his quote. In July of 64 AD, there was a fire that lasted for about a week that burned much of the city of Rome. It destroyed completely 3 of Rome's 14 districts and severely damaged 7 more. And a lot of people blamed Nero for the fire. And there's dispute on whether he was actually responsible for it or not. But the reason they blamed him is that a whole bunch of prime real estate right in the middle of Rome was clear, and Nero ended up building his Domus Aurea, or Golden House, in the place that had gotten burned by the fire. And scholars debate on how big this house that he built was, but the estimates range between 100 to 300 acres. So that's about 75 to 225 football fields, including the end zones. And Suetonius records this: "When the edifice was finished in this style, and he," meaning Nero, dedicated it, he deigned to say nothing more in the way of approval than that he had last begun to live like a human being." End quote. So the city gets burned, a bunch of people die, and quite a lot of ones who survived became homeless. And then Nero builds a ridiculously huge building and says, "Finally, I can live like a human being." You can understand why people would be upset at him. And so, whether he started the fire or not, a lot of people blamed him for it. And, not surprisingly, he had to divert the blame to somebody else. Enter the Christians. And this is where we are going to pick up for a quote, and that's sort of the background for what Tacitus is about to say. Now, Tacitus, who was probably writing this around 116 AD, was about 85 years or so after the death of Jesus, so it's between the other two quotes, says this, quote, "Consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilatus, and a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out, not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. Accordingly, an arrest was first made of all who pleaded guilty. Then upon their information an immense multitude was convicted, not so much of the crime of firing the city, as of hatred against mankind. Mockery of every sort was added to their deaths. Covered with the skins of beasts, they were torn by dogs and perished, or were nailed to crosses, or were doomed to the flames and burnt, to serve as a nightly illumination when daylight had expired. Nero offered his gardens for the spectacle, and was exhibiting a show in the circus, while he mingled with the people in the dress of a charioteer or stood aloft on a car. Hence, even for criminals who deserved extreme and exemplary punishment, there rose a feeling of compassion, for it was not, as it seemed, for the public good, but to glut one man's cruelty, that they were being destroyed." End quote. So from this, we can get several things. Christ suffered the extreme penalty, probably meaning crucifixion. Christ was put to death by Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius. And again, we can see Christianity was called a superstition. which meant that the people were excessively devoted to the religion. Also, this whole Christianity thing, according to Tacitus, started in Judea, but then it spread to Rome. And Christians were hated for a while, but there was a feeling of compassion for them because of all the horrible things Nero was making them suffer. So, those are the three references about Jesus in Greco-Roman sources from outside the New Testament that were written in the first 100 years after Jesus' crucifixion. Now, I definitely could have summarized all of that instead of going into all those things in detail, but I thought most people hadn't read those passages, and I figured you might want to hear them. Basically, they talk a little bit about Jesus, but they really only talk about Jesus in reference to Christianity. And so here's the question that a lot of people ask. If Jesus was so important, why wouldn't they simply talk about him? Why is there not more about Jesus in them? And I think the answer is that very simply, like most people, the Romans were only interested in something when it affected them. They only became interested in Christianity when it got large enough for them to take notice. And even then, they were only interested in the practices of Christianity and what it meant for the empire. They weren't interested in the religion for its own sake. And so information about Jesus was just not that important to them. They only cared about Jesus insofar as he affected Christianity, and they only cared about Christianity insofar as it affected them. So the reason we don't have more about Jesus from secular historians was simply that Jesus just wasn't that important to them. And I mean that he wasn't that important to them. Now, he would become more important later, but he wasn't important at that time because Christianity wasn't that important. However, Jesus was mentioned. And even though he was not mentioned as much as we might like, and as we saw, there was a good reason for that, he was mentioned. So, that's basically the first objection that mythicists claim for why Jesus couldn't have existed. So, let's move on now to the second objection. And that's that the only author outside the New Testament who does mention Jesus is the Jewish historian Josephus, and the reference to Jesus in his writings were added in later by Christian scribes. All right, we'll deal with the objection, but first, who is Josephus? Josephus was a Jewish historian who was born in Jerusalem in 37 AD. Because of how close he was to the events of the early church, he was an eyewitness to the rise of Christianity. Now, he was not actually an eyewitness to Jesus' life because he was born shortly after Jesus died. He was pretty close, historically speaking. And his largest work, Antiquities, which is a history of the Jewish people, contains 2 references to Jesus. The authenticity of these is debated, however, and you'll soon see why. And like with the previous examples, I'm going to read you the quotes. First up is Antiquities 1863. Quote, "About this time lived Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man, for he was the achiever of extraordinary deeds and was a teacher of those who accept the truth gladly. He won over many Jews and many of the Greeks. He was the Messiah. When he was indicted by the principal men among us, and Pilate condemned him to be crucified, those who had come to love him originally did not cease to do so, for he appeared to them on the 3rd day restored to life, as the prophets of the deity had foretold these and countless other marvelous things about him, and the tribe of Christians so named after him has not disappeared to this day." End quote. Given that Josephus was a Jew and never became a Christian, the obvious question is, how could he say all this stuff about Jesus like he was a wise man, if one indeed ought to call him a man, and he was the Messiah? Because of this, most scholars think that somewhere early on, before the 3rd century, some Christian modified this passage. A minority of scholars believe that this passage is entirely authentic, and a much smaller minority believe that it's entirely a Christian forgery. So most scholars believe that there was an original passage that was modified by a Christian after the Jewish Josephus wrote it. Now, there was another manuscript discovered, which is admittedly much later, 10th century AD, which has something more like what a Jew would have probably written. This is probably very close to the original version. Let me read it to you. Quote, At this time, there was a wise man called Jesus, and his conduct was good, and he was known to be virtuous. Many people among the Jews and the other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and to die, but those who had become his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he had appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion and that he was alive. Accordingly, he was perhaps the Messiah, concerning whom the prophets have reported wonders, and the tribe of Christians so named after him has not disappeared to this day. End quote. Now, if you'll notice, this passage is much more modest in its portrayal of Jesus, and there's nothing that a pious Jew could not have written. Most scholars think that Josephus originally did write something like this. So what you have here is a first century Jewish source, Antiquities was written in 94 AD, from a man who was born and raised in Jerusalem and would have witnessed the Christian church in its early stages. That source records some of the basic facts about Jesus. Now, along with this, there is a second reference to Jesus in the same book, Antiquities. And the fact that the second mention of Jesus is so short means that it's probably referring back to the one that he wrote earlier, which means that this one that he wrote earlier, the one that we just discussed, was almost certainly there. It wasn't, completely added in later. Otherwise, the second reference would make no sense. In Antiquities 20:200, we find this, quote, "Having such a character," which was rash and daring in the context, "Ananus thought that with Festus dead and Albinus still on the way, he would have the proper opportunity. Convening the judges of the Sanhedrin, he brought them before the brother of Jesus, who was called the Christ, whose name was James, and certain others. He accused them of having transgressed the law and delivered them up to be stoned." End quote. This passage has none of the same problems as the first one. We just see, quote, he brought before them the brother of Jesus, who was called the Christ, whose name was James, end quote. This passage is really about James, and is explaining which James this is by relating him to his more famous brother, Jesus. The passage simply says that Jesus was called the Christ, at least by some. That's all it's doing. It's just saying that some people called James's brother the Messiah. There are no Christian additions here. And so, like the previous passage, a pious Jew could have written this. And so when you put these two passages together, what you have is a first century Jewish historian mentioning and giving some basic facts about Jesus. And Josephus would have been in a position to know whether this Jesus guy really did exist or not, because he was born in Jerusalem just shortly after Jesus died, and while this whole Christianity thing was just getting going. And there's also no good reason that he'd want to make any of this stuff up. So all that together is pretty good evidence. Okay, so that's the first two objections by the people who think that Jesus was just a myth. Now there's 3 more objections that we have to cover, but before you get worried that this is going to go on till the end of time, I'm not going to cover them in anywhere near as much depth. I went into more depth on the first 2 primarily because I wanted to share with you those quotes, because I figured many people hadn't heard them before, and you'd want to hear what the primary sources actually said. Too often we hear people who talk about what the people back then said. I thought you might want to hear what the primary sources themselves actually had to say. So let's get to those other 3 objections. We're going to go through these a little bit more quickly. And then we'll move on to the positive evidence in favor of Jesus' existence in the next part of this episode, part B. So objection number 3. Mythicists claim that there are very few references to the historical Jesus in the New Testament outside the Gospels. By this, they mean that people like Paul don't talk about the historical Jesus much in their letters. In part B of this episode, I'm going to give you 2 good reasons to think that Jesus actually existed, and one of them will show that Paul thought that Jesus existed. So I'm going to hold off on this one for the moment because we're going to get to that shortly. So just put number 3 on pause and we'll come back to that in part B. See, I told you these are going to be quicker. Number 4. The Gospels are the only real sources of information about Jesus. The mythicists will argue that these were written decades after his death, and that makes them highly problematic as historical documents. They have lots of contradictions in them. They're obviously biased. There's obvious legendary development, and so on and so forth. And also many will say that the Gospels go back to just one source, Mark. Now, the question of the contradictions in the Gospels is something that will take an entire series to cover, so I can't just hit that in a single point. But I think I should point out that there's actually a contradiction in these objections. In other words, you can't believe both of these objections, in number 4 that we're talking about. You can't believe both of these at the same time. You can't say that there's a lot of contradictions in the Gospels and that the Gospels are based off a single Gospel, whether Mark or any other one. The fact that they're contradictory would prove that they didn't just merely copy. So it's either one or the other. You can't have both. Either they copied Mark so much that they're really all just one source, or they're wildly contradictory, and so you have 4 different sources. So on the one hand, you only have one source, but it's a very consistent source because it's told 4 different ways. Or on the other, you have 4 unique sources, and while it's hard to figure out exactly what happened, you at least have 4 independent sources. So, I'm not saying that I believe either one of these objections. What I'm saying is that the mythicists are making 2 of these arguments and they contradict each other. You can't have it both ways. Either you've got 4 independent sources that, aren't terribly reliable, but you have 4 independent ones, or you have one that's really good. It's just because it's told 4 different ways. You've got to pick one. Anyway, to the question of whether or not you can trust what's in the New Testament as a whole, a little while ago I did a whole series on where our New Testament comes from. I traced its development from a Jewish man walking around teaching and doing stuff in Palestine 2,000 years ago in another language, all the way up to the written Bibles that you can hold in your hands and are written in your own language. So if you're interested in whether or not the New Testament contains at least semi-reliable information about what probably happened in the past, I think that understanding how it all was put together will help you with that. And as long as the New Testament isn't wildly inaccurate, the objection that the Gospels are our only real source of information doesn't work. I put a link to that series in the description of this episode in case you're interested in going into that further. Now, the 5th and final objection that the mythicists bring up is that many of the major stories about Jesus have parallels in pagan religion, such as dying and rising gods. Now, the most important of these would be stories, as I said, about dying and rising gods, and we could get into that. And it would take a while to work through all the specific examples, but I really don't think that's necessary. I think I can make a much more foundational objection that applies to all of these sorts of parallels, especially the dying and rising gods, and show why that's not a problem for Christianity. Okay, think about what we know about some of the big issues in early Christianity. A lot of them had to do with the Gentiles. Can Jews eat with Gentiles? Do Gentiles have to be circumcised and follow the law of Moses before they become Christians? Can Christians eat meat sacrificed to pagan Gentile gods? So, with all of that, the question that I want to ask is, how could the Christians have taken stories about dying and rising gods, as well as other stories, and use them to form the basis of their new religion, and then all of a sudden have problems with this Gentile stuff? Either they're okay with the Gentile stuff or they're not. I mean, which is it? If they're okay with borrowing it in the first place, then what would cause them to stop and all of a sudden be like, oh no, I can't have anything to do with this Gentile stuff or with you Gentile people? And it doesn't make any sense to say that they tried to borrow it secretly so that no one would know. I know a lot of people say, well, they borrowed it and then they, sort of push the Gentiles out of the picture to cover their tracks. If these parallels are obvious, like some people claim, and they're just so completely transparent, then just about everybody back then would recognize it, even more so than we did today. Because When we're saying that they borrowed from other religions, they're supposedly borrowing from other religions that are currently being practiced by their neighbors. You would notice if your neighbor's new religion looked a lot like your own, old religion. It's not going to escape their notice if you take the central elements from what they currently practice or what their friends currently practice, and you try to claim that this is a whole new thing that just happened. It's going to be pretty obvious. Besides, if you're trying to grow a group, whether religious or any other kind, putting a whole bunch of strict rules on people that aren't used to it, or keeping half of your people from being able to eat with the other half, is really not a good way to try to get people to do it. You don't build a group by creating artificial divisions between large portions of your people. That's not helpful to getting a group going. And you probably wouldn't have, these questions about can Gentiles be a part of this or not, unless these were actually real questions. And all that points to the early Christians actually believing these objections and these issues with the Gentile stuff. And this brings us right back to the original question. Why would the early Christians base their religion on stuff that comes out of Gentile religions and then all of a sudden have problems with Gentiles and their practices? It seems much more likely to think that they did not borrow these stories from Gentile religions. And that means that this argument against Jesus existing just doesn't work. Okay, so that was a lot. Those are the 5 main objections against Jesus being a real historical figure. And I think we've seen that they just don't hold up very well. The question we need to ask then is there any positive evidence to think that he actually did exist? The answer is yes, and as I said, in order to provide a little order to this episode, I've split it into parts. We've looked at the reasons why the objections against his existing don't work. Now, in the second part of this episode, we're going to take a look at the positive evidence, the reasons to think that he did exist. And it will be shorter than this one. So, if you're ready, move on over to part B, and let's take a look at the reasons to think that Jesus did exist.